Alright, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to shift gears again and we're going to turn further west from Greece and we're going to start looking at ancient Rome. This is not necessarily going to be chronologically after everything that we've talked about. For example, the conquests of Alexander the Great would have happened later than the establishment of the city of Rome. However, the story of Rome carries history forward further than the story of ancient Greece, at least ancient Greek culture. And so we're going to start off looking at Rome and their social structures and their establishment, and we're going to see eventually how that kind of interplays between Greek and Roman culture and eventually blends into what we call Greco-Roman culture. So before we get started with any history, I usually start talking about the aesthetics of a culture and how you can kind of tell where one civilization begins and another ends based on their aesthetics. For example, it's really easy to be able to differentiate between ancient Egyptian aesthetics and ancient Mesopotamian aesthetics or ancient Greek aesthetics, and they're very culturally and even ethnically distinct from each other. If you were to look at the Romans, a lot of their aesthetics are familiar to us because we've borrowed heavily from Roman and even from Greek architecture and aesthetics. We typically think of the Roman Empire as very glorious, very charged with energy when it comes to the impression that it seeks to make, and they knew that about themselves. They were conscious about that. They were consciously looking to inspire future generations. I don't know if they ever expected, especially earlier in their history, if they ever expected that their civilization would fall. For example, they called Rome the Eternal City, but they definitely did want to inspire a sense of awe and respect out of surrounding civilizations and perhaps later civilizations. They had a list of virtues that they sought to adhere to, and chief among those, you had pietas, gravitas, and dignitas. These are Latin words, but they sound very close to their English equivalents of piety, gravity, and dignity. Piety is this idea of the fact that you have certain responsibilities to your civil institutions, the city of Rome, for example, but also responsibilities toward the gods. And because you have responsibility toward gods and your fellow man, you don't complain. You're not supposed to, complain about how hard something is. You just shut up and do it. So whatever your responsibilities are, you just set yourself to the task of fulfilling those responsibilities. Gravitas can be thought of as a sense of seriousness. They eventually, in Rome's history, they're going to be influenced heavily by Stoic philosophy. But even before Zeno or before the Stoa, the Stoic school of thought that gets established in Greece, the Romans already think of themselves as very grave, serious. They're not a light, flighty, party, laugh all the time type of people. They do become decadent and they start to turn away from some of their original values, but gravitas is this sense of not everything has to be a punchline. You need to show some seriousness in the tasks that you're about to undertake. And then dignitas, you can think of almost like glory, the fact that you want to handle yourself with integrity and dignity so that you are preserving the reputation of your gods and your culture and the city of Rome herself. So we know that today Rome is located in the Apennine Peninsula, which would be Italy, give or take a little bit of land up there in the north of the Alps. But they were not the only civilization, or they were not the only city, town structure, culture that was developing in the Apennine Peninsula. We have several different contenders for who's going to dominate that area. So Rome begins as a small little city on the Tiber, and eventually they do set about to try to conquering a lot of the land around them. A lot of people think, and I think rightly so, that this is inspired by the fact that in 390 they are sacked by the Celts. The Celtic people defeat the Romans in a battle well north of the city of Rome, but then because the Roman army has been defeated, they invade the city of Rome and they just live there, and they They party and they rape and they pillage and they take whatever they want from the people of Rome, and it winds up being after a series of weeks or months of the Celts being in control, they are bought off with a ransom of a massive amount of gold. They are just given all of this gold and treasure to finally leave, and the Romans set themselves to never letting that happen again. But there are other people on the peninsula. You have the Etruscans that are a little bit north of Rome. You have Carthage, which is not just the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, but it's actually a massive trade-based empire that's developing in North Africa, even on the southern coast of Spain. It originates over in the Levant, in today what would be Lebanon, what you might call Tyre and Sidon. We'll talk more about them in the next lesson. Greece has also started to spread her influence onto the Italian peninsula. You have what's called Magna Graecia, which just means Greater Greece. Obviously, when we're thinking of Greece and the Balkan Peninsula, we're thinking of, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, maybe even the western coast of the Anatolian Peninsula, what today would be Turkey. But they had started also to spread their influence and even colonize different areas, as you can see here on the island of Sicily, or the southern part of the Italian peninsula. So Rome is not alone, and they definitely feel that, and they take that threat, or perceived threat, very, very seriously. If you were to look at the social institutions of Rome, you have what are essentially three classes. You have the patricians up top, and then you have the plebeians and the slaves in the bottom. The patricians were an elite noble class. You could not attain this class. This is a class that you had to be born into. So your blood had to be the blood of a patrician father, a patrician mother. Patricians were forbidden from marrying anyone who was not a patrician, and they held all of the civic power. They were the only ones who could, specifically the patrician men, were the only ones who were able to attend the assemblies and have their voices heard, to vote, to sit in various different councils and elected offices. So the plebeians were considered citizens, but they didn't have any say in the way that the institutions of Rome were going to be run. And then the slaves were considered property. They were usually captured, conquered people. Interestingly enough, and this is not necessarily untrue in other ancient cultures about slavery, but we see it maybe particularly emphasized here in Rome, the fact that a plebeian could become a slave and a slave could become a plebeian. And even during the life of a plebeian or a slave, your life wasn't necessarily all that different. Many times it was, but it didn't have to be. Here's what I mean by that. A plebeian who is in debt or who couldn't find any work for themselves could sell themselves into slavery. If you were a plebeian, you did have citizenship, which didn't mean that you could vote, but you did have legal protections. Your property couldn't be stolen. Your physical body couldn't be harmed. But the plebeians, like I said, they could sell themselves into slavery. And likewise, a slave, sometimes, many times in fact, a slave would have a relationship with his master where, let's say that I'm able to do X amount of work for you, and I'm able to kind of earn my keep and not just pay for my room and board and food, but I'm able to earn you a certain amount of money on top of that. So if I'm able to earn any money over and above X, I can keep that kind of in an account or in a credit account. I don't mean credit like, we think of credit cards online, but I just mean, I'm storing up some sort of credibility with you that I am a hard worker, and I might be able to keep some of that money for myself, or and spend it on things that I want, or alternatively, I could even save up toward purchasing my own freedom. So a plebeian could become a slave, could sell themselves into slavery in hard times, and in particularly good times where work was very profitable, a slave could even purchase their own freedom. And because of this, if you were a slave owner, which obviously not everybody was, it was usually a small amount of elites that would own slaves in pretty much any culture. If you were a slave owner, you actually had an incentive to educate your slaves, maybe to teach them how to read and write, how to perform a specific trade or a skill such as carpentry, masonry, leatherwork, weaving, pottery, things like that, because that means that the work that they did could earn you more money. And again, some people even had a arrangement where if I was able to earn my master X amount of money, then I could use the rest to purchase my own freedom. And a plebeian, likewise, they might be skilled, they might know how to read and write, or work a potter's wheel or a weaver's loom, but they might only have unskilled labor to offer, which means that they might be doing things like mining or working a small farm or ditch digging, things like that. So while plebeians did have legal protections and slaves did not, I mean, if you were a slave, you were property. Your master could kill you without really any legal consequence because you were his to do with what he wanted. However, these lives did they were not necessarily always as distinct as one might imagine them. Again, a plebeian could become a slave. A slave could purchase their own freedom and become a plebeian, and oftentimes have even some limited amount of civil representation and protection under the law. So if we talk about religion in ancient Rome, a lot of times people would say, and there is some truth to the fact that the Greek gods and the Roman gods overlap. It's not as simple, however, as, okay, well, the Greeks they have a sky king weather god and they call him Zeus, and the Romans have the same sky king weather god and they call him Jupiter. There is, interestingly, an etymological root there, even between Zeus and Jupiter. Jupiter being, you have this idea of the word deus, with deus in Latin, and in Greek, you would pronounce that more like Zeus, and that just means God. Deus means God. But if in Latin you were to call him God the Father, Deus Pater, you'd kind of, shorten that to Deus Pater or Jupiter. Likewise, you have, it's not simply the fact that you have a Greek god who's named Poseidon, and then if you are Roman, then you call him Neptune. No, these originally they were distinct gods. They had distinct narratives, myths about themselves, even distinct origin stories. But later in Rome's history, especially as they come to conquer and rule over the former Greek Empire, these stories start to bleed together. You kind of start to have this new canon of theology. However, the way it's been described to me is that they didn't take these gods as theologically seriously as, let's say, a lot of Christians or Muslims do, where it's like a Christian would have a very specific held belief about, okay, here's God, here are the things that God can't do. For example, God can't lie. Here's the origin story of the world. It's all very canonized. It's all very official. There's not to be any deviation. However, the stories of the gods were maybe another way to think of them is like, okay, these are the stories of Spider-Man, or the stories of Captain America or Batman, Superman, just some kind of comic book character where it's like, okay, largely it's agreed upon that he can do this, he can't do this, and the priests specifically who would work the temples of these gods, they would maybe have more specifically held beliefs, but the mythology and the theology of the Roman gods was kind of up for grabs. Different people could kind of mix and match different ideas about the gods, so it's not like everybody had an official belief about the gods that they had to adhere to. Not only the gods, however, down here on the bottom I've included a few pictures of a religion or a form of religion that would have been very impactful on the life of the typical Roman, and that is the cult of the family, or the cult of the fathers. You would make sacrifices to your ancestors. You would have shrines to your ancestors. This reminds me very much of Chinese Confucianism, even though it would be distinct in its practice. But there was a high-scale veneration of your ancestors, especially if you were a patrician, because your ancestors were, the descendants of previous patricians, and those previous patricians were supposed to have been descendants of Hercules, and therefore descendants of Zeus, God the Father, Jupiter, perhaps I should call him, himself. They had these things that were called death masks. When the male patriarch of a family would die, you would instantly pour hot wax over his face, and you would wind up making a cast image of his face, and these faces would be hung kind of like we hang pictures of our family members, even deceased family members, on our wall. These faces would be hung in the Roman home, And whenever the patriarch of a family would die, there would be a feast, a festival, kind of like a little party in honor of that person's life, and the children would actually wear the masks of the previously deceased ancestors, and they would know the stories of their ancestors. They would know the stories of, okay, this is what my great 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 grandfather accomplished during his life, and this is what my great 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 grandfather accomplished during his life. They took all of this very seriously. They took immense pride in the accomplishments of their ancestors, the dignitas, the glory of their ancestors, and because of that, they had a desire to earn glory for themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the political institutions. This is definitely what I would say Rome's legacy has largely been, is the impact of their political institutions. Not to say that they haven't impacted a lot of other things, and we'll talk about that throughout these lectures, but this is something that they're really well known for because it was very well structured. Early on in their history, Rome is actually a kingdom. The city of Rome is said to have been founded around 750 BC by Romulus and Remus, being the divine sons of a god and raised by a she-wolf. But you have most of these kings were actually elected by a council who themselves were elected by the general assembly of all of the patrician men. So you can kind of think of like Athens. You would have a general assembly where every patrician man, every man who had full first-class citizenship in Rome, could show up and speak, but they didn't vote on every single matter. A lot of times the thing that they were most responsible for doing was electing a smaller board of people, a council of men, known as the Senate, to make a lot of the governing decisions of the city. So the assembly would elect a council, and that council would elect a king. So this is different from a strict monarchy where once you're the king, your son instantly becomes the next king. Your firstborn son instantly becomes the next king upon your death. No, instead, if you died, the council would elect who the next king is. And this went on for about 250 years. And you have 7 kings. Again, it's not really agreed upon whether this is supposed to be more mythological or whether this is supposed to be more historic. I mean, the idea that you have 7 kings who, on average, are each having reigns of like 30 to 35 years, that's pretty far-fetched. But you have 7 kings, and the story goes that they become progressively worse and worse. And so eventually the people of the city of Rome rebel, and they kill their last king. They wind up dethroning him, making sure that there are not going to be any more kings going forward, and they adjust the political system really to give the majority of the power to the Senate. So the patrician males are still able to vote in their councils, but a lot of that power is stripped away from them and is given to the Senate. So the members of the council, the members of the General Assembly still elect the members of the Senate, but the Senate does pretty much everything else, and they don't elect kings anymore to take care of things for them. So the position of king, the idea of Rome being a kingdom, lasts from about 750 BC to about 500 BC. So for about 250 years, Rome exists as a kingdom, and then after this revolt, after this, maybe I should call it a revolution, Rome is no longer a kingdom. Instead, it is a republic, and it's going to be a republic for about 500 years when it becomes the Roman Empire. And we'll talk about kind of how those words are used a little bit in the next lecture. However, the republic form of government, that you'll remember Plato wrote his whole treatise on the idea that a republic was the ideal form of government. Rome takes this idea and actually manifests it in the political structures of Rome. So instead of having one king that you elect what's called a consul, and you would elect 2 of them. So you have 2 consuls that were elected every year. You would have your elections, and you would elect a new consul. And originally, you could only serve as consul once in your life. One consul would be responsible for kind of handling things at home, tax collection, and then the allocation of that tax money to build, the forum, which would be kind of like your city center, your governing center, or different temples. Building Roman roads was considered very important to them so that they could manage things further out from just the city of Rome and have more of an impact on their growing territory, aqueducts, things like that. So one consul would be responsible for leading the government at home, and then the other consul would be responsible for leading the legion, leading the army against the Celts or the Etruscans or the Greeks or whoever it was that you were waging war against at the time. And importantly, they would switch who was at home and who was abroad, leading the military every month. So for 12 months, you would serve as a consul, and but every month you had to switch off between whether you were the tax collecting, civic management consul, or else the more general military consul. And this was supposed to severely limit the impact or the power that any one man would have over the government, so that you couldn't wind up with any kind of tyrant or any kind of wicked king who just did whatever it is that he happened to want to do at that time. Interestingly enough, however, they also had this position that was called the dictator, and the dictator was a position that was elected. This was not someone, when I think of a dictator, I think of someone who, maybe they take their power by force. However, what this guy did is that if there was a period of specific crisis, where there's, maybe an invasion, or maybe there's a drought or something, a plague, something that's costing a lot of lives, and something where you can't really afford to allow all of this, bickering and arguing and disagreement in the Senate, where you have 100 different patricians that have 100 different opinions. What they would do is they would say, okay, for the next 6 months, we're going to elect a guy to essentially serve as the king. He's not a king. They were very against the idea of naming anyone as the king, that anyone could have the position of dictator for the rest of their life. But for 6 months, a limited amount of time, complete control of the treasury and complete control of the military was handed over to this person, specifically with the idea of solving this problem. So from this, we have the symbol that's called the fasces. This is, interestingly enough, where we get the word fascism from. But the fasces is this bundle of sticks that's bundled around an axe. And essentially, you can think of this as a symbol of them saying, hey, we're giving you all of the power over life and death. So that's the axe. And the rest of us, although we're stripped of our power, we don't have any, axe blades on ourselves. We're like these sticks or these rods. We're going to collect ourselves around you. We're going to unify around you in order to protect your power, so that you can use your power for whatever it is that you need to do in order to take care of the problem of this invasion or this plague, or again, whatever the issue is. And famously, the most famous of these dictators was a man named Cincinnatus. And Cincinnatus was the personal hero of George Washington, because he is the supreme example of someone who took complete, unlimited authority in order to solve a problem. He solved the problem, and then he handed the authority back to the government of Rome. And this is what you were supposed to do as a dictator. And this is what every dictator did for about 500 years. Whenever they would elect a dictator, they would take the power for up to 6 months. Maybe if I'm able to solve the problem in a month or 4 months or whatever, then I hand the fascia, or the fasces rather, I hand that back over to the Senate, and it's me saying, okay, the money and the military are back under the control of the Senate. The consuls that you've elected, to switch off every month, they can now have power over the purse and power over the sword, to do as they see fit. And this is a big deal. The idea that you're handing someone unlimited authority over, what's originally just a small collection of cities, a small kingdom. It had been during the Roman kingdom era, but Rome's not necessarily a huge deal in the year 500 BC. But by the time you get to 200 BC, when you're getting into what we'll call the Punic Wars, we'll talk about later. When you hand someone absolute authority over Rome, you're handing them a massive amount of authority. One of the strongest nations in the world would have been the Roman Republic at that time. And you're saying, hey, you can do whatever you want for the next 6 months. And the idea that they would not just hold on to that authority and they would hand that authority back over to the Senate meant that they took seriously their civic responsibility, their responsibility to the city and the people of Rome, their responsibility to the gods to act with pietas, gravitas, and dignitas. Furthermore, you remember that class of people, the plebeians, they had no representation originally in the Senate. So you have the Senate that could only, was elected by the General Assembly. You had to be a patrician in order to vote in the assembly or to be elected to the Senate, or furthermore to be elected to the consul. And even then, you only have a term of 1 year, so you have the idea of term limits. And so only patricians could elect consuls, could elect dictators if the need arose for there to be one. However, eventually by a threat of we're going to stop working, or a threat of violence, and a threat of violence, the plebeians are able to gain an office for themselves. That they have an elected body, which is called the Concilium Plebis, and they have an elected position, which is called the tribune. And there would be 10 tribunes that were elected at any given point after this revolt. And the Concilium Plebis was elected by a parallel body, so the patricians made up an assembly that elected the Senate, and the plebeians made up an assembly that elected the Concilium Plebis. And the Concilium Plebis would elect 10 individual tribunes, and the tribunes did not necessarily have a lot of power themselves to enact any kind of legislation or to accomplish anything. But the important power that they had was the veto power. Veto is a word that we still use even in American politics and politics around the world today, but it is a Latin word. Veto is the word for I forbid it, right? So if a consul said we're going to spend this tax money on the construction of a new temple, or if a consul said we're going to use the Roman legion, the Roman army, to wage war on this people group, if any one of the 10 tribunes said, no, we're not going to do this, it didn't happen, which meant that you needed a lot of buy-in. You needed a lot of approval, not only from the elite patrician class, but now even from the plebeian class, in order to get something done. And remember, I would say, just like with the American government, we might say, well, man, it seems like nothing would ever get done. It seems like they would never be able to accomplish anything. And that's almost the point. You don't want a government that's able to just change direction every 6 months and, oh, now we're all about this. Now we're all about welfare. Now we're all about military expansionism. No, you wanted for there to have to be a lot of agreement on something before it was actually put into practice. And if you could do that, then you could rely on the fact that once you're actually in the process of doing something, the people, the plebeians and the patricians are both behind it. They're both going to, morally support it. They're going to enthusiastically support it. Think of the fact that you needed 10 tribunes. All of them had to agree to something before even the patrician consuls were able to do something. And this style of government that we see, of having an upper house and a lower house, continues into British Parliament and American Congress today. Last thing we'll talk about is the Roman Constitution. It's called the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables come out early in the Roman Republic, and they're heavily influenced by the legal precedents that had been set by Solon, or they parallel the legal ideas of... You remember that Athens had the archon, the leader whose name was Solon, and his ideas are largely represented here, even though you're in a completely different culture, civilization. I shouldn't say completely different. We do use the word Greco-Roman for a reason, because they're, in a sense, similar. But 12 Tables of the Law, you can think of these almost as like the different articles of the Constitution. And I have some of them highlighted because it says, it shows some things that are very similar and precedents that continue even until today. But also some of them are highlighted because they point out, okay, well, this is a very different ancient group of people that don't necessarily think the same way that we do today. But if you think about the fact that, look here at the very beginning, the accused person must attend court. This is still the idea of habeas corpus today, the idea that you have a right to stand in your own trial. An accusation can't just be made against you and then you don't have the ability to speak on your own behalf or to present evidence in your defense. No, you actually get to attend a trial against you. You see the next one I have highlighted, it says an unresolved debt would lead to either the debtor's execution or you could be sold into slavery across the Tiber River, right? So you could be sold as a slave if you owed someone an amount of money and you had not already settled it within 60 days, then you could be sold into slavery, or the owed person, the creditor, could say, hey, I'm just going to have this person executed, and their belongings will be sold, my debt will be resolved, and the rest of it will be handed over to the state. Also, you have this idea that a deformed child will be killed at birth. This reminds me a lot of Sparta and the fact that if a child was deformed or sickly in any way, they were left on a hill to die. And this was, they thought of as a virtue in order to make that person less of a burden to the state. Next, you see that women are always supposed to be under the guardianship of some male in their life, whether that's their father or their husband, due to the frivolity of their character. So they're perceived to have had a frivolous character, and so because of that, even if you were a patrician woman, you didn't have any legal standing as far as you couldn't vote in the assembly. A plebeian woman couldn't vote to elect members of the concilium plebis or a tribune. They couldn't serve as any of those people. A verbal promise that you make is considered legally binding. Down with the seventh table, it says that this is interesting when it comes to like property law. It says that fruits, if I have a tree and it drops fruit onto your property, it's considered your property, not mine. I suppose in a very agricultural society, that was something that did pop up from time to time. The eighth table, I think, is one of the most interesting. I have 4 stars on this one. It says that if you sing some kind of harmful spell or incantation, that could be punishable by death. Like if I catch you singing a curse over me or my family or over Rome or something like that, then I could actually have you executed for that. If I injure you, then you are allowed to injure me in some kind of reciprocal way. Think of like an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type of thing. If you were found to have given false testimony, borne false witness in court, then you were thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, which is an elevated cliff, just kind of in the city of Rome. You would be thrown off of that, and think about the fact that you wouldn't necessarily die for that, but you could be left broken and bleeding, and because of that, it would take days for the vultures might even start picking away at you while you're still alive. Nighttime gatherings without the city are prohibited. I think this one's kind of funny, especially when you think of the fact that today, culturally, people will say, if I have a Latin temperament or a Latin, personality, then maybe I stay up late, and there's a big party that's really loud and it's going on really late. No, in the origin story of Latin is the story of Rome, and they would say that nighttime gatherings within the city are prohibited. Remember, we have pietas, we have responsibilities. We need to be up early so that we can work hard for the furtherance of our, our civilization. When it came to public law, you have the idea that laws are not supposed to be made secretly. If a law is passed, then it has to be made public so that it can't be used to punish people that don't even know that it's a law. No one's supposed to be executed without proven guilt in court. We talk about the presumption of innocence even today. The idea that you're supposed to be considered innocent until you're proven guilty, and that's when you can be punished. You have a prohibition on not only drunkenness, but excessive displays of wealth. So the idea of flexing, a solid gold Lamborghini or something like that was prohibited. Why? Because, well, what's the reason that you're driving that solid gold Lamborghini or, whatever, fancy horse that you have, fancy chariot that you have? A lot of times it's to inspire jealousy or envy in the other people, and it's like, well, why are you doing that? These are your fellow Roman citizens. We don't want you to do. If you have a lot of wealth, that's great. Keep it to yourself. Save it for your children. Maybe buy some more land with it. However, we don't want you to be displaying all of these costly jewels and things just for your own, aggrandizement, for people to think that you're so great, because it actually harms the fabric of the society that you're a part of. Intermarriage between plebeians and patricians is prohibited. Remember that you had to be full-blood patrician, and one way that they guarded against this is that they said that even if, let's say that you're a freed slave, you purchased your own freedom, you became a citizen at the lower level of the plebeian, you could never become a patrician. That was not something that you could purchase. That was yours by birthright, by your blood alone. And then on that last table, 2 things. False accusers face double penalty or death. So if I accuse you of something and I say, oh, this guy owes me, $10,000 because of, some fraudulent contract, and I'm found to be a liar, then I face double penalty. And remember, if I lie in court specifically, then I could be thrown off of the top of that Tarpeian Rock. And then it talks about what the acceptable forms of punishment are. And, we have our own thoughts about, how capital punishment should be administered, or how different forms of punishment, corporal punishment, should be administered. They had 8. You could be fined, you could be shackled, which means that you're sold into slavery. You could be flogged, so tied to a post and beaten with a whip on your back. You have what's called lex talionis, which is reciprocal injury. I knock out your tooth, you knock out my tooth. Public humiliation. This could just be your crimes being read in public for everybody to know. Hey, this person is a liar, a cheater, a stealer, whatever it is. Enslavement, and then finally you have capital punishment, which would be execution. So any of these things, whether it's prison or enslavement or fines or execution, these were all considered acceptable forms of punishment in ancient Rome. So when I think of this, when I think of the precedents that are set here by Rome, a bicameral lawmaking body, 2 houses. You have the Senate and the Concilium Plebis, a written down constitution that your entire government apparatus is supposed to function by. This is something that continues on even until today. Most famous examples might be British Parliament that has the upper house and lower house, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and they have, in a sense, they have a written constitution in the Magna Carta, even though they do also have what's called common law, which is unwritten. In the United States, we have a bicameral legislature. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives, and we have a written down constitution that can be amended. So again, I cannot overstate how, when it comes to politics or law, the Roman standard is the standard that shapes the world going forward. We'll talk a little bit more about the history and the expansion of Rome as a republic, and then eventually its metamorphosis into an empire in future lessons. But for now, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you have a blessed day.